In pressured situations, we all tend to become more of who we are. So if you're a kind of uptight person and you're really frightened that you're going to be doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, then if you're the interviewer or the interviewee, then that's going to be what you're going to be feeling.
Welcome to the Agile Digital Transformation Podcast, where we explore different aspects of digital transformation and digital experience with your host, Tim Butera, Content and Community Manager at AgileDrop.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Our guest today is Nicholas Samstag, clinical psychologist and host of the Mental Health in Business podcast. We actually just recently recorded an episode together for Nick's podcast, which we'll link to in the show notes once that one is out. And today, Nick joins me to discuss family dynamics in business. Welcome, Nick. Happy to have you here and really great to get to speak with you again today.
Well, thanks, Tim. It was such fun the other day, and I'm sure we're in for more this time as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I feel exactly the same way. I can't wait for the first one we did to get published, and I actually can't wait to jump into this one. So obviously, let's start with the broader things. So, just the basics of family dynamics in like organizations or groups and how that translates to the business context.
Right. So there are many theories about this, to be sure, as there are in my field. We're sort of always awash with different theories. But the ones that have spoken to me the most are broadly defined as systems theories. And systems theories basically look at groups and try to understand what the intergroup relationships are. So anytime you have more than one person, if two people or more, you have a system, according to this way of thinking. A system meaning that there are necessarily communications across all kinds of dimensions, intellectual, emotional, behavioral, certainly. There are all kinds of behaviors and communications that we exhibit, some conscious, some not. And those different types of communications form into what these theorists would call a system. So it's a system. So it's not one person in a silo, another person in a silo. It's about groups of people and how they interrelate. So every organization, be it business or theological or military or anything else, any organization has its members coming from their different families. And people come into organizations having developed within the crucible of the family. So if you're the oldest member of your family, you're accustomed to being treated in a certain way. If you're a middle child, if you're the youngest, if you've been sick, if you've been dominant, whatever that is, whatever your early experiences are in your family, in the system of the family, will necessarily be rearticulated in any other context that you're in. And I guess among the very interesting things about this for me is that anyone running a business, anyone being a CEO or a leader in business or in any institution, has to necessarily understand this if things are going to go as well as possible. You don't have to be a psychologist. You don't have to take courses in this, although courses probably wouldn't be a bad idea. But you just have to understand these people don't come from a vacuum, and they're not all the same. None of them are the same. And many of them have had not so good experiences in their family of origin, not necessarily, thinking about abuse and all of those horrible things, but, it's hard being a human being. It's hard developing. Puberty is hard for all of us. Parents, however well-meaning, gaslight their children inadvertently. And so you come to the business world, and all of that's on display from every single member of your team. So I guess to say this in a succinct way, the impact of early family dynamics on a business situation is going to be a recapitulation of those dynamics. And so it's up to the people in charge to have some kind of sensitivity to that and to understand that if you have, a very high performer who was the eldest sibling in his environment, he or she is probably going to be a dominant voice. And that, I'm just pulling this out of my head, right? But someone like that, although very potentially profitable to the company and a good asset, also may need to be reined in, because that person may drown out other people who also have good things to say, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, those are definitely some concrete examples of like what leaders need to be mindful of, or more specifically, how leaders can use this knowledge, the topic that we're discussing today, to kind of, streamline both of, I guess, their processes, their company culture, their business operation? What would be some other important implications for leaders, I guess, both on the executive level as well as just people managing different teams within organizations and firms?
Yeah, good question. I think, as you know, I've discussed recently, I think the notion of psychological mindedness, unfortunately, doesn't have much traffic. And I think again, business leaders owe it to themselves and to the people who work for them to cultivate psychological curiosity. And unfortunately, with psychology, it's not until there are massive problems that people pay attention. Psychology is often seen as, oh yeah, sure, blah 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 blah. But you know what? To be somewhat astute, psychologically speaking, is for everybody's good. And so how do you do that? I mean, I think you can take courses. I think you can read books. Unfortunately, the HR departments in many corporations are the sort of the center for things psychological. And they, in my opinion, are not particularly well trained and don't have really, in once again, my experience, I'm sure there are exceptions. They don't have as much of an impact, a positive impact as I would like to say, as I would like to see. But what's an example? I mean, let's just imagine a typical work environment where, there are the bosses and there are the workers and there's a hierarchy, right? So the minute you have all that happening, you have what in my field is called transference, where everyone in the institution is assuming things about the leaders that may or may not be true. Like they're bad people, they're good people, they're going to save me, they're going to, so you have all kinds of systemic articulations where the workers will act in large part to try to curry the favor of those who are leading the show. And what the leaders can do is be aware of that. I mean, this is not, there's a lot of this stuff that's very complex. This is not that complex. We just have to think about this, right? You and I were talking the other day about, I think we were talking about transference, and people do look towards the leaders as kinds of saviors. And so the leaders have an obligation, I think, to themselves and everybody else to be sensitive to that, you know? What kinds of conversations are you having with what kinds of people? I mean, the conversation issue I always find fascinating. If you start being curious about conversations, you'll be mystified because you'll wonder, why are they having this conversation? And why are they getting angry about that? And is that
Mhm.
actually the subject, right? So many of this is probably no news to you. So much of the fights that I see in my practice and in couples, when individuals come and tell me the tensions they have with their bosses or their subordinates, so many of these conversations are really great examples of how people are not psychologically aware. The subject of these conversations or fights are often pretty ridiculous. It's like that's not what's going on. Something else is going on. So I think that's something we can do, they can do. We can become curious about, why are we saying what we're saying when we're saying it? And none of this, I should say this, none of this is about just being nice. That's another thing about psychology, like, oh, just be nice to people. No, that's not the point. I mean, yes, we should be nice to people, but that's not the issue. We should be curious and thoughtful about human interaction.
Also, I really like the distinction between nice and kind, because often these get mistaken for being the same thing, but very often something nice will not be kind, and something kind will come off as the opposite of nice. But I guess you could also add, besides curious and thoughtful, you could also be kind, and that takes care of the nice aspect, so to speak.
You caught me on naive the other day, and I so appreciate this. I had one of my favorite professors in boarding school was professors, teachers in boarding school was a real stickler. And if wrote the word nice on any essay, he just failed us. He said, Nice is a ridiculous word. It doesn't really mean anything. Never use it." So, so I think, yeah, he would be in agreement with you, certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, and you were talking about the importance of conversations, right? And in the context of the business, I guess it all starts with the initial conversations. So, the first interviews that people have with potential employers, and just how everything is communicated, how information is relayed. So how do family dynamics play into this aspect of work? So how you hire and what kind of questions you ask while hiring, your candidates?
Yeah, that's another great question and many different ways to answer it. I think a good thing to keep in mind, and this is just basic psychological awareness stuff. I think we all feel insecure. I'm not saying that on a pathological level. I don't think we're all diagnosable, although most of us, I think, are diagnosable. But when the people hiring and the people looking for a job, they both, all of us, all of them, always have certain types of anxieties, right? And so something to keep in mind is that we all work from some level of insecurity.
Mhm.
And so the conversations that ensue will reflect that. If when I was a little kid, actually, my mother had these great lawn parties, and she had really fascinating friends. And I was always just mystified at the conversations. Like, why is Mr. So and so always talking about his horses? Like, I've seen this guy for years. Every party, horse, 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 horse. Then somebody else would always talk about his bank account. He'd always be talking about money. And someone else would always be talking about his relationships. As a kid, I was just like, what's going on here? Like, why, first of all, what does this mean? And why are there such patterns here? So I think, in the interview situation, this is probably the right thing to say. In pressured situations, we all tend to become more of who we are. So if you're a kind of uptight person and you're really frightened that you're going to be doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, then if you're the interviewer or the interviewee, then that's going to be what you're going to be feeling. You're going to be feeling like, oh, I can't really screw this up, right? If on the other hand, you're someone who gets enjoyment and relaxes in interpersonal dialogue, then these situations will be actually kind of pleasant for you. You'll be like, oh, I wonder what's going to happen here. That'll be great. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. As pressures build, we tend to become more of who we are. When external impingements become great, if you're kind of a hysterical person, you're going to become much more hysterical. If you're someone who's calm in the face of difficulty, that's what's going to happen. And none of this should be heard as judgmental or evaluative. It's just who we are. It's a function of personality. Personalities remain consistent over time. That's a whole big subject. I would say that. So family dynamics are always with us wherever we are, one way or the other. And the interview situations are tense on both parties.
So are there any specific tips on how people hiring or people doing the interviewing or people, reviewing candidates can maybe take this into account and, make sure that it doesn't negatively impact how they pick and choose candidates?
I'll say this about that. I assume that when candidates come in, they've passed a number of tests already.
Mhm.
So their resumes, their recommendations, they've cleared the first few hurdles because nobody wants to waste anybody's time. So at that level, when people are coming in, I don't think it's a good idea. And unfortunately, this happens across professions. I don't think it's a good idea to go out of your way to create tension.
Mhm.
And people still do this, I mean, especially, I would say, especially in the tech industry. I've just heard, people would go in for 7, 8, 12 interviews, and they would just be grilled over and over and over again by different people, and it's exhausting and it's unpleasant. And I don't think that method of hiring is a good one because some people do very well with that. Other people, not so much.
Mhm.
And I think it's often those kind of stress interviews, those repetitive stress interviews are often the product of, CEOs or leaders with big egos. It's like let's put them through their paces. Let's put their nose to the grindstone. On the other hand, I think if you can connect with the person in a more genuine way, ask them about themselves. Now, I appreciate we live in a time where everyone's aggrieved over everything. And, I'm not suggesting any breaking of boundaries and, you don't want to ask people about their sex life or. what they dream necessarily, obviously. But I think it would be well within your rights to ask them, you know, how do they spend their free time? When they get angry, what do they look like? What kind of friendships do they have? I mean, that might be something that people go, oh, none of your business. But you know what? We spend most of our time at work. I mean, whether it's on screen or whether it's in person. And I think it well behooves us to find out on a much more granular level who we're dealing with, because we're going to be dealing with them.
Mhm.
So, certainly childhood questions, again, not horribly intrusive questions, but what was your childhood like? And if anybody says it was a perfect childhood, don't hire them. And so you rightly called me out on the term naive the other day, which I've thought
Mhm.
about, and I agree with you about. So if we were to translate that unfortunate word into another word, which does not assume blame on that person, I would say and this is going to be hard in the tech industry and any industry probably, but you probably don't want people working for you who are massively unaware psychologically.
Mhm.
Not that that's their fault, but that's not going to go well. You don't want people who are hyper touchy. You don't want people who are completely incapable of looking at how they affect human relationships. You don't want those people because there's just going to be problems. They're going to turn around and sue you, or they're going to call somebody, or they're going to, right? And they need to go into therapy, or they need to work in a cubicle and never talk to people. I think there's room for that. There's room to be kind. There's room to be kind and also discerning. And if you're hiring for positions that are leadership positions, for example, or that have a lot of responsibility, you do not want to hire touchy people who are easily aggrieved. You do not want them because it's a nightmare. And there are many people probably with the same qualifications who can stand that or actually enjoy being in the spotlight.
Yeah, as you said just a little bit earlier, ego tends to be the problem in these kinds of situations. And yeah, it's also a problem if you are unable to discern like an overpowered ego in somebody and hire them despite that. So yeah, definitely an important consideration right there.
Yeah, and I also think, and this again, people could say, I didn't sign up for this, but I think any activity that brings people together in the workplace whose agenda is only to, you know, enjoy one another, I think those are good things, right?
Mhm.
I mean, from the mailroom to the C-suite, like whatever, whether it's a picnic or whether it's a party or whether I mean, those things typically don't go well because no one actually leads it, and it starts to sound a little like group therapy, and it may be not a bad thing. But, instead of going out and just getting hammered with your colleagues or, going to some fancy resort and, spending a lot of money, if there were people on board who had some kind of psychological acumen, you could just, you could create outings in which people would get a chance who one another is. And that has been shown by Harvard and other places. That's been shown to be really good for the bottom line, which is
Mhm.
why everybody's there. It's actually profitable to be psychologically engaged.
And I guess that this becomes even more important now in the era of hybrid and remote work, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a great problem slash opportunity, as you and I talked about a little bit, where, yeah, I mean it's certainly possible to relate on screen, and I think I said this the other day, and the people who have trouble relating on screen have trouble relating off screen. I don't think that the determining variable is a technology. I think it's personality. And so people respond. I found this during COVID. I mean, I did not know that I was going to have my practice almost exclusively online. And thank God there wasn't online. Otherwise, I'd be driving a cab. And I was amazed at how well people did. And I did on screen. Like it was like, okay, we're on screen. But it wasn't that the screen created some kind of psychological difficulty. The psychological difficulties were there or not, and the screen was for some people just another vehicle to communicate. But to be sure, my opinion, the screen is not the same as in person. Insist that's too strong, but I certainly make a case for people coming in when they can because it's just better. But yeah, you can relate to people online, absolutely, but you have to want to. And you have to be able to transition from the business speak to the more, related interpersonal speak, and that's hard to do.
Mhm. So maybe in the context of our specific conversation, so family dynamics, Is there anything specific here? So, is something more greatly expressed in person and maybe should be paid less attention to online or vice versa, stuff like that?
No, I think, I was trained in it in many different ways, but a great part of my training was to be curious. There's a lot of ink has been spilled in philosophy and psychoanalysis about this. I mean, just to be curious. And I've talked about this. You can't be curious if you're frightened.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't be curious if you feel that you're on unsteady ground. So I think for people to be curious about one another, for people to ask that question is often very helpful. And then if they have trouble being curious, they can ask themselves what's going on and hopefully deal with it. But people by and large, and I hate generalizations, and I'm about to make one, people by and large operate, I'm not the first person to say this, operate from the standpoint of safety. We tend to do things that we think will augment our safety and not to do things that we think will increase it. It's called security operations in some literature. So, whether or not people feel comfortable speaking or initiating or responding or whatever it is, so much of that is about their security operations. And the more secure you can help people feel, the better things will go. The more pleasant things will be for sure, but you'll get the better ideas because there's some shy guy or girl in the mailroom who actually has a great idea, but they're not going to open their mouth if they feel that they're going to be slammed.
So it should be psychological curiosity that we mentioned early on, together with psychological safety, another important concept here.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think we need help. It's hard being a human. It's really hard. We're all, there's a lot to deal with. It's a big job, and there's no manual. But I think in an ideal world, the people running the show would have, more than a bit of psychological awareness. And so they would treat people, I mean, this sounds all obvious, right? They would treat everyone with respect and and they would also have very clear boundaries. That's a good thing to talk about.
Mhm.
Boundaries. What does a boundary mean? Boundary means what is okay and what is not okay to do, and how am I going to treat people, right? I mean, boundaries constitute the fabric and the structure of every interpersonal engagement. You know, why am I talking about this? How am I talking about this? Have I hijacked someone into this conversation or have I invited them? How do I go about the day? How do I respect people's time? Boundary, boundary, boundary. You know, I spend a lot of my time talking about boundaries. And boundaries are not there to be, they're ad infinitum. They're just there to be, we need them. Otherwise we can't function. So being kind doesn't mean being boundaryless.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very good point, definitely. And Nick, another great conversation. And I just have one final question. I guess not that directly related, but a little bit related to everything. Since we're discussing family dynamics in business, I wanted to ask you if you have any thoughts on this kind of recent trend of companies, especially startups, to market themselves as families in a way. What are your thoughts on that?
Bad idea. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Super bad idea. Super bad idea. Why is it a bad idea? It's that old adage, right? It's like you don't choose your family, you choose your friends. And everybody's family is not wonderful. In fact, no family is wonderful, in my opinion. So you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. I think you could come up with a much better idea. I mean, the word team sounds sort of trite and hackneyed these days, or maybe you don't even want to put a word to it. But I think what you're looking for, what I'd be looking for if I was running some business, is you want a bunch of dynamic, relatable, interesting, and kind people. That's what you want. You want to go to work in the morning knowing that you've got people next to you and around you who are smart and engaged and boundaried,
Mhm.
boundaried. And families have no boundaries typically. Families typically have no boundaries, or they have boundaries everywhere. That's just not helpful to anybody.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I love how we connected everything and a great note to finish on, another great conversation, Nick. Before we wrap it up, if anybody listening right now would like to reach out or connect with you, what's the best way to reach you?
Oh, that's great. So yeah, so my website is Nicholas, Nicholas at nicholassamstag.com. And you can find me there with all my stuff, good or bad. There I am.
Okay, awesome. We'll also include that in the show notes as well as a link to your podcast. And once it's live to the episode that we did together, looking forward to seeing both live and re-listening to them again. Thanks again, Nick. Excited to get to speak with you again sometime soon.
It's such fun, Tim. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers. And
Bye.
to our listeners, that's all for this episode. Have a great day, everyone, and stay safe.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to check out our other episodes, you can find all of them at agiledrop.com/podcast, as well as on all the most popular podcasting platforms. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new episodes, and don't forget to share the podcast with your friends and colleagues.